Joe Dawson was a family man in his 20s, before the change. His family, his wife and daughter had moved to Dark Chasm to take the next step in his study and his religious pursuits. Joe Dawson was a cleric in a land of many gods, but he was training and studying to become a cleric in devotion to a specific god. For him, it was the god of death, a lawful god, the god that believes that every soul, every body, every person deserves their funeral rites, whatever it may be, in this land of thousands and thousands of gods. And he had come to Darkchasm, this mining town far off in the kingdom of... I forget what I called it last week. Helder, something like that. And he went to become a gravedigger for this town, this mining town. He raised his family in that cemetery. No temple, you know. Most people have different gods. It's just that Joe Dawson was called to this one. This is not a god most people worship. It's as much a business as anything else, as it is devotion. But Joe Dawson was not only a devoted man to the higher powers, to the gods. Obviously he prayed at other temples as well. He minded the other gods as well. But he was also a family man, a loving father, a wife. And it's just a young man who's going to raise a great family, and he is going to accomplish so much in life, right? This is just his early youth, his beginnings, his walk towards whatever greatness was awaiting him. But unfortunately, he was moving to a town called Darkchasm. And not too long after he arrived, the sky began to scream. Trumpet sounds out of the sky. He had been working as a graveyard gravedigger for years, giving people their fire burials, depending on whatever it is their favored god required of them. A couple of years, 2 years, he and his family lived there in relative peace. In fact, it wasn't too long before he would move up into a city, perhaps, or a place of more demand. A place like Darkchasm is for the young. And the retiring, I suppose. But there was a day where the sky turned black, and I'm sure you've heard of the sky trumpets. It's a phenomenon here. We're not sure if it's the wind or if it's angels with horns. And here in this world, not in the world of Darkchasm, but in this world, is said that at rapture in Christian mythology, at rapture, the angels will play out. And I've actually recorded the theremin, my favorite instrument, actually playing the Dies Irae. Had an Italian composer play it for me. I'll play it now. This is the sounds of screams that are coming out as terrifying, cruel, pain sounds. But it doesn't have the same meanings as it does in Christian mythology. Now, Joe's not quite sure, but it sounded to him like all of the good gods responding in absolute anger and fury and fear at something that had just occurred. The screams seemed to be echoing, billowing from the Castle Raven, as though all of the good gods were just leaving that realm, that place, as though good had been completely banished from Dark Chasm. And the screams, they hung over that graveyard. And though they started at Castle Raven, it's like they pulled at the graveyard where all the buried had been, where all the souls had been burned, where everybody had received their funerary rites. The screams didn't stop there. The sounds of trumpets and horns and anger and fury just filled above that cemetery. For a day. And Joe Simmons didn't know exactly what had just happened here, but he knew his whole life had changed. One of my webcams has frozen. It's been doing that a lot on me recently. Yeah, it's frozen. It sucks. I'm gonna switch it out. I got a new one anyway. So I'm making this up as I go, by the way. Brainstorm for a while. No outlines, nothing written. But he continues he stays. He's staying the night. He's not sure what this means. He's afraid. And, of course, he's a gravedigger in a place the gods of law and good have left. And that night the dead rise. And this could be Grindhouse in its depiction. The zombies coming to the doors and the windows, and a slow process. I imagine if it was a Grindhouse story, where they begin with his house and they're gonna leave and out of the cemetery and go off to actual Dark Chasm. These zombies, these corpses. But Joe, good man, cleric, a priestly man, who believes the dead should be in the ground. The dead are dead, right? And there's no more offensive thing to a gravedigger, to a man who's devoted himself to the god, the pagan god of death and to die, is for his soul to raise. And the first night wasn't easy. The first night he discovered just how unskilled he was in dealing with the undead. But he did have advantages, and he survived. He managed to put all the dead back in the ground in which they had come from. Yeah, he had won. At a terrible cost. His wife and daughter didn't survive the first evening with the zombies. And there wasn't any way Joe could have saved them. The simple truth is there were a lot of bodies in that cemetery, a lot of skeletons, soldiers, men who'd gone off from the land of Dark Chasm, called by the king, led by Lord Damien Dante Raven, you know, before the change. Obviously, this is the night of day one after change. The screams happened as a result of the change of Lord Damien Dante, his transition into a vampire. But of course, we're not quite there yet. For Joe Morg, he didn't know any of this. To Joe Morg, all he knew was something had driven out the gods. And he was left in a vacuum. And for some reason that night, after the last zombie fell, he looked up at the castle raven. And he noticed it was glowing. A very faint glow. In fact, in the blackness, he was surprised he had never noticed it before. But in that moment, it had a red behind it, and the fire in the sky behind it. As though hell itself was opening behind the castle raven. As though the fires of hell were in the sky and something was coming out at him. Now, of course, this isn't Christian hell. This isn't where souls go when they die. This is the Nine Hells, a very different place, the pagan world. And Joe was better the next day. But on the first morning of the second day, he buried his wife and child. And he had fought as hard as he possibly could. And as he was laying the final shovel of dirt onto his daughter's grave, and he stood there crying, he looked over and saw a young woman standing in the trees watching him. Young, black hair, pale skin. Joe hesitated. He looked at her and he recognized her as an extenuated corpse. She was as pale as anybody he had embalmed. Again, some gods require extenuation. And he looked at her and he realized she was an extenuated corpse. But she was standing there watching him. Now this is, of course, not a zombie. A zombie is decay. A zombie is rot. A zombie happens from burials and corpses that are left without eyes, coins on their eyes or whatever their gods demand. This one was something different. This is a different type of corpse. There was a consciousness in there, something looking back at him. Not the blankness, not the emptiness in this one, but a child. And a little girl smiled at him and said, "I'm sorry for your loss." And Joe Dawson, he knew what this was now. A vampire. Who would do this to a vampire? Who'd do this to a child? Right, is running through his head. This poor child. And he's just asking himself what to do. What do you do? And the little child vampire girl looks at him and says, "This has been prophesized. Waited thousands of years for this moment, for this man. We don't get rest. We travel. We hide. where there's a vampire prophecy that one day a man will come that will give us a place, a safe haven, to hide from the hunters and the killers and the slayers, the people who want to drive us out and stake us. And I believe there is no good in the undead. It was prophesied that a good man would one day become a vampire. And he would make safety for us. The little girl smiles at him. And he realizes this isn't a little girl. This is a very old woman. This had happened to her before time, before history. And as this little girl is walking towards the Castle Raven, he says to her, "Who gave this prophecy? Who says this was destined to happen?" And the little girl smiled and said, "Well, it was my prophecy. I wrote that prophecy." And he realized this is a powerful witch, a vampire witch, thousands of years old in the appearance of a child. And she left. And Joe Dawson returns to his cemetery, and again that night the dead rose. And that night he had to kill his wife again and his daughter, who had both come back as zombies. And on the next morning he buried them again. And that morning he watched a commander. My one note for this story. His name was Commander Kuban. He was the city guard, but he had been called away a while before for a battle of the king in a distant part of the land. Obviously, established Darkchasm is on a mountain ridge in the far corner of this kingdom, an isolated place. This is day 2 now, and this commander is leading an army back to the Castle Raven. And Joe says, "Is the war finally won?" And the commander says, "No, I have no idea. We received a raven, a crow, with a note on his leg that said, we must return to the Castle Raven. And so I'm going to go find out what is needed. But, we serve the king, but ultimately it's the city guard, and it's our job to protect this city. If we are required by the Castle Raven to be here in this moment, then we are here." And the commander left. But this wasn't the last time that day you'd see him. That day, the guard gathered. And that day, the commander of the city guard came to Jack Dawson. And he was extenuated. Just no blood left in him. And yet he was moving, the same as that little girl. This Commander Chawbon, was as dead as she was. And he looked at Joe Dawson. I'm sorry if I said Jack just a moment ago. He looked at Joe Dawson and he said, "All right. You are, you were our gravedigger. You're free to go, but you're needed here. The dead are rising. Dead zombies, evil things, mindless things, have no understanding, no compassion, no humanity. And they're going to continue to rise. This is cursed land now, from what we understand. The gods have left, the good gods. And this town will be overrun. From what I understand, you killed a lot. You destroyed a lot. And Luda walked out. The guard was asking Joe Simmons to stay and continue to protect this city from the undead. As, actually, pardon me, not Joe Simmons, Joe Dawson. As Joe Dawson had been instructed to do. I mean, that's the rule of his God, is the dead die. They get their funeral. They're not supposed to rise. And Joe Dawson realized this is a life pursuit now. He's never leaving. He's never leaving if he stays. But to leave is actually to turn his back on his God, essentially. And so Luda comes up to him and says, I know you've lost so much. This child witch, she looks at him and she says, trust me, I've seen it. I've seen the pain. I've seen the suffering. And she tells him that if he does this, she'll let him see his family. They haven't fully crossed. They're only walking the roads to whatever afterlife they were on. And Luda tells him that she can get him a goodbye. Not with the corpses, not with the things that were rising from the grave, but with them, who they were, who they are as they pass. And she also says, and she can make sure those bodies will never rise again. Those bodies will never rise again. And Joe Dawson agrees. It's his responsibility to protect the city of Darkchasm from the undead. And he swears himself to it. And Luda teaches him some tricks, some magic. How to sneak, how to snap your fingers and ring the bells for the undead. He becomes an assassin with daggers, allowing the grass of the cemetery to rise tall so he can sneak through it and take out the zombies when they rise. And this isn't the bodies of the dead anymore. What this cemetery is now just a nightly creation of corpses, undead things, skeletons, sometimes just made of dirt and blood. Every night for thousands of years, this land, this place of the dying, will produce corpses. And it's his job to keep them down. And he becomes good at it. Very good at it. But of course, sure, man, a soul can live in devotion and in contemplation. A soul can be truly connected to the divine. That wasn't enough to fulfill Joe Dawson. For the rest of his life, he lost his family. He said his goodbyes. He made his peace. But he had nothing in Dark Chasm. Nothing that kept him going. All of his joy was gone. He was a man with a future. It was almost as though, immediately following the change, he'd lost his soul. In the same way Lord Damien Darken Raven had. Lord Damien Dante Raven decided he dedicated his life to being good. Joe Simmons, over the years, he lost who he was when his wife rised from the grave and his daughter rised from the grave. And he became something different. It wasn't obvious at first, right? He was taking his path. He was walking it. But in the years to follow, he became bitter and angry. And of course, eventually, as 20 years passed, 30, new generations began in the city of Dark Chasm. Lord Damien Dante Raven lived in his tower. Strange princes of this new land came forth. They were now at war with King Hecate, or King whatever I named him last week. I'll have to look that up. Memorize that one, maybe. And those outlying city, was now a place that he protected from the undead. But his evenings were drink and anger, resentments. He fell into his fury, Joe Dawson. And that, of course, changed many, many years later. When a crow man, body or the head of a raven and the body of a man, but with feathers for hands, a new kind of species that had just come from beyond the Feywild, perhaps. It's unsure. Maybe the land of fairies. He never really knew. But a young Kenku, a young crow man, an orphan, came into the city. Of course, one of the greatest curses, aside from being cursed as a vampire or cursed as a family man who has to keep his wife and child in the ground in a cemetery. This crow man is similarly cursed. He, they can't speak, they can't write because of their feathered hands. They're tortured creatures. And the city of Dark Chasm, though they call him Joe Morg now, and the children mock him and tease him and tell him how wretched he is. They give him the wretched child, the crow child, to raise and to take over for him when he passes. And of course, crows, they age much slower. In these Kenkus, they are very slow to age. Joe Morg, it seemed, was slow to age too. This was 60 years, and he's an old man, but he just seemed to stay 100 years, really. I mean, he was there. He was there all the way past the birth of Ravel Raven. After the eradication of an entire line of men in that city, the death of all the Witchbanes, he was there all the way to the war between vampire and demon. And his child he named Jack Doll. And he raised Jack Doll. But he wasn't a father to Jack Doll. Teacher, a drunk and angry man. And we'll tell the story of Jack Doll, more of a story unfolding. Of course, Jack Dawson was the man who came and stabbed that man first, came to collect the body of the vampire hunter we told the story of last week. And, well, that's 30 minutes now. I've been ranting. Thanks for joining.